The journey has been long and difficult, but the final resolution is finally within your reach today. Stay with us as we piece together the last bit of the puzzle and reveal the final truth. Click subscribe now and witness the most important ending of our cinematic arc.
The morning my wife's estate attorney called to confirm the reading of Eleanor's will, my daughter-in-law was already redecorating in her head. I could see it in the way she walked through my front hallway when she and my son arrived that afternoon, her eyes moving over the crown molding, the wide plank oak floors, the original fireplace mantel I had installed myself 32 years ago. She wasn't grieving. She was measuring. My name is Robert. I am 67 years old. For 35 of those years, I built a network of private medical clinics across Middle Tennessee from nothing more than a borrowed exam table and an absolute refusal to quit. My wife Eleanor stood beside me through every sleepless year of it. She answered phones when we couldn't afford a receptionist. She balanced the books when we couldn't afford an accountant. This was not inherited wealth. This was a life constructed, brick by careful brick, by two people who believed in each other completely, or so I believed. Eleanor passed on a Tuesday in late October. Pancreatic cancer. It moved fast, the way that particular cruelty always does, and gave us just enough time to say what needed saying, but not nearly enough time to say everything. I held her hand at the end. The hospice nurse stepped out of the room, and in those final quiet minutes, my wife looked at me with her gray eyes and said something I didn't understand until much later. She said, "Robert, I am sorry for the weight I put down for you to carry." I thought she was talking about her medical bills, or perhaps the burden of being a caretaker for 8 months. I kissed her forehead and told her there was nothing to be sorry for. I was wrong. She had been apologizing for something else entirely. The house was quiet after the funeral in a way I had not anticipated. 40 years of marriage fills a home with a kind of constant low frequency, a hum you stop noticing until it goes silent. I would walk into the kitchen and hear nothing. I would sit in the den in the evening and feel the absence of her like a physical pressure against my chest. I was not a man who had ever been very good at stillness, and the stillness of that house was nearly unbearable. My son Daniel and his wife Michelle came by 4 days after we buried Eleanor. They did not call first. I heard a car in the driveway and looked out the window and saw Michelle climbing out before Daniel had even put it in park. Her eyes already on the house, her chin already raised in that way she had. That particular angle of her chin always meant she had made a decision about something. I let them in. I offered coffee. Daniel accepted, which was the first sign that he was uncomfortable. My son only drinks coffee when he needs something to do with his hands. Michelle declined, which was the second sign. She never sits still long enough to drink anything when she has an agenda. They settled into the living room. Michelle smoothed her skirt and launched directly into it without any preamble at all. "Robert," she said, "Daniel and I have been talking, and we think the most sensible thing, given everything, is to start talking seriously about the transition plan for the clinics." She said the word transition the way a real estate agent says the word opportunity, like it was something to be celebrated. I looked at my son. He was turning his coffee mug in slow circles on his knee, watching the motion like it was the most interesting thing in the room. He would not meet my eyes. Daniel had always been a gentle person. His mother's gentleness, I had always thought. He had her patience, her soft way of listening, her discomfort with confrontation. He was a good man in many respects, but sitting in my living room 4 days after we put his mother in the ground, watching his wife strip the paint off my retirement, he looked less like a good man and more like a man who had simply stopped trying. "I haven't been thinking about business," I said carefully. Michelle tilted her head in what she must have thought was a sympathetic gesture. "Of course not. And we don't want to rush you. But someone has to think about it, Robert. The clinics don't run themselves. Daniel has been essentially managing things informally for years now, and honestly, it's time for that to become official. It's time for his name to be on the door." Daniel's name was not on the door because Daniel had never wanted his name on the door, and we had both understood that for a long time. He was my VP of operations, good at logistics and scheduling. not particularly passionate about medicine or business development. He showed up, did his job well, and went home. That was fine. That had always been fine with me. What was not fine was his wife deciding, while my wife's grave was still fresh, that showing up and doing his job was the same thing as earning ownership of what Eleanor and I had built. I told them I needed more time. Michelle smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and said, of course, take all the time you need." They left an hour later and I stood at the window, watching their car reverse out of my driveway, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet. Something more like an old foundation settling, like the moment before a structure decides which way it intends to fall. It was a week later that everything changed. I had been going through Eleanor's things slowly, the way you do when you are not ready, but you know it has to be done. Her reading glasses on the nightstand, her calendar still open to October, her tablet on the desk in her small study, the one she used for crossword puzzles and video calls with her sister in Baton Rouge. I had been charging it out of habit, I suppose, or because unplugging it felt too final. I picked it up that evening to look at some photographs. Eleanor had been meticulous about photos, organizing them by year and occasion, and I wanted to find the ones from our anniversary trip to Asheville 3 summers ago. I opened the gallery and found the Asheville folder easily enough. But when I went to close the application, I noticed something I had never seen before. There was a second folder, buried several layers down in a subfolder she had simply labeled E. Not photos. Documents. A folder of scanned letters and what appeared to be several years of email correspondence. I almost closed it. My first instinct was to close it and put the tablet down and go make myself a drink and think about anything else. Eleanor deserved her privacy. Even now, perhaps especially now. But then I remembered what she had said at the end. The weight she was sorry for putting down for me to carry. And I understood, in the way you understand things you don't want to understand, that the weight was in this folder. The emails went back nearly 22 years. The man's name was Gerald Ashworth. He was a professor at Vanderbilt, apparently, and from the tone of the earliest messages, he and Eleanor had known each other since well before I came into the picture. The first several years of correspondence were warm and nostalgic. 2 old friends checking in, remembering shared history. But there was an undercurrent in every exchange, a careful tenderness that went beyond friendship, a quality of restraint that only exists between people who are actively choosing not to say the obvious thing. Then I found the exchange from the spring that Eleanor was pregnant with Daniel. I have lived through some difficult moments in my life. The death of my father. A lawsuit in the clinic's 2nd year that nearly ended everything. The 8 months of watching Eleanor decline. None of those moments felt quite like reading those emails in the quiet of her study with the lamp on and the house completely still around me. It was not one revelation, but a series of smaller ones, each landing like a step on a staircase I had not known I was descending. Gerald Ashworth knew about the pregnancy before I announced it publicly. He wrote about it with a particular grief that was not the grief of a friend. He wrote about what it meant for him, what it meant for her, what it would mean for the child. He wrote, with the restraint of a man choosing every word carefully, that he understood her decision, that a child needed stability, a present father, a life without complications. He wrote that he would honor whatever she asked of him. He wrote that he hoped the child would have her eyes. Daniel has Eleanor's eyes. Everyone always said so. I sat in that chair for a long time. I am not sure exactly how long. At some point, I became aware that my hands were shaking slightly, not from emotion but from something more fundamental. The way your hands shake when the thing you are holding turns out to be heavier than you realized. I set the tablet down on the desk very carefully, as if it were something fragile. As if I were something fragile. I went to bed eventually, though I did not sleep. I lay in the dark listening to the house and thinking about 40 years of a life and wondering which parts of it were real. The memories did not disappear, but they did something strange. They rearranged themselves, slightly. The way furniture looks different when you move one piece and suddenly see how the room has always been organized around it. By morning I had made a decision. I called Frank Morrison at 7:45. Frank and I had been friends since our 30s, back when he was building his law practice and I was building my first clinic, and we both worked the kind of hours that make your wife periodically threaten to leave you. He had drafted every significant document in my professional life. He had written my will and Eleanor's. He knew every clause and subclause of the corporate structure that governed the clinics, because he had written most of them. He was the right person to call, and I knew it. And he picked up on the second ring, because Frank always picked up. I told him everything. I told him about the tablet and the folder and Gerald Ashworth and the emails. I told him about Michelle and Daniel, and the visit and the word transition. Frank listened the way good lawyers listen, without interrupting, without exclaiming, making brief sounds of acknowledgement that meant, "I am processing everything you are saying." When I finished, there was a pause. "Robert," he said, "before we talk about any of the legal questions, I need to ask you one thing. Are you sure you want to know for certain?" I told him I was already certain. I needed the documentation. He understood. He told me what we would need, and how to get it without raising any flags. He said the most reliable method was something Daniel had left behind himself, without knowing it. When Daniel and Michelle had visited the week before, Daniel had used the guest bathroom. He always used the guest bathroom when he came to my house. He had since he was a teenager. His electric toothbrush was still on the charger in there. He had bought it specifically to leave at my house for his visits, and in all the chaos of the past weeks, he had not thought to take it. Frank told me to package it carefully, to handle it with gloves, and to send it to a specific laboratory in Atlanta that he trusted for this kind of work. He told me he would handle the chain of custody paperwork from his end. He told me he would call Michelle and let her know that I was ready to discuss the future of the clinics, that we should schedule a formal meeting within the next few weeks, and that I was open to hearing their proposal in full. "Let them prepare," Frank said. "Let them think they're walking in to collect." I asked him how long the lab results would take. He said 10 days to 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks were the strangest of my life. I went through the motions of grief, which were not performances exactly, because the grief was real, but they existed alongside something else now. Something cold and watchful that I had not known was in me. I answered condolence cards. I met with my clinic managers one by one to reassure them that operations were stable. And every morning I woke up and thought about a man named Gerald Ashworth and a spring 43 years ago, and a choice my wife had made and carried for the rest of her life. I did not hate her. I want to be clear about that. I had loved Eleanor completely, and I did not stop loving her because of what I found. But the love changed shape. The way water changes shape when you pour it into a different container. It was the same volume. It occupied different space. Michelle called Frank 3 times during those 2 weeks. Frank told me about each call with the same faint, professional amusement. She was confident. She had a presentation prepared. She had consulted, apparently, with a business attorney of her own, someone who specialized in family business succession. She told Frank she wanted to make sure the meeting was substantive, that they weren't going to waste anyone's time. Frank told her, "Of course. Absolutely. Robert wants this resolved as much as anyone." The results arrived on a Thursday. Frank called me at 9 in the morning, and I sat down in the kitchen chair without being fully aware that I had moved. He read me the key finding in the methodical way he read everything, without inflection, without commentary. The probability that Daniel was my biological son was less than 0.01%. The science left no room for interpretation. I thanked Frank. I told him to confirm the meeting for the following Tuesday. He asked if I was all right. I told him I was ready, which was not quite the same thing, and he understood the difference and did not push. The clinic's main administrative office was in a building I had owned outright for 18 years, a converted Victorian on a tree-lined block in East Nashville that we had renovated ourselves when the neighborhood was still considered risky. The conference room on the second floor had tall windows and exposed brick and a long walnut table that Eleanor had found at an estate sale and insisted on refinishing herself. She had spent 3 weekends stripping and sanding and sealing it, and the result was something genuinely beautiful, a piece of furniture that looked like it had always belonged in the room. I thought about that as I sat at the head of it on Tuesday morning waiting for them to arrive. They came in like a delegation. Michelle first, in a structured blazer, carrying a leather portfolio that I could see was thick with printed materials. Daniel behind her, his shoulders carrying their familiar apologetic curve, his eyes scanning the room and landing briefly on mine before sliding away. Their son Tyler, my grandson, came in last, 17 years old, and conducting himself with the elaborate boredom of someone performing indifference. He dropped into a chair at the far end of the table and put in his earbuds without acknowledging me directly. I noticed he took one earbud out after a moment, which told me he was paying more attention than he wanted anyone to know. I greeted them. I offered water. Daniel took some. Michelle declined, just as she had at my house 3 weeks ago. She opened her portfolio before I had fully settled into my seat. Robert. She laid her hands flat on the table in a gesture that was meant to convey openness but conveyed instead the opposite, a woman claiming territory. Thank you for agreeing to this. I know it's been an incredibly hard few weeks. Eleanor would have wanted us to handle this thoughtfully. As a family, the invocation of my wife's name from Michelle's mouth was a specific kind of audacity. I let it pass. I nodded and waited. She had indeed prepared a presentation. She had printed copies for all of us, which she distributed with the efficiency of a consultant who has done this before. The cover page read, in a clean sans serif font, Callaway Medical Group Succession Framework. My clinic group was called Callaway Medical Group. Seeing it on her cover page, formatted and branded as though it were already hers, produced in me a clarifying silence. She walked through it section by section. The proposal was, I'll grant her, professionally constructed. She had clearly paid her attorney well. It involved a transfer of 65% of the company's equity to Daniel, with a 5-year buyout structure for my remaining 35%. It repositioned me as a founding advisor, a title with no operational authority and a modest monthly retainer that was, as near as I could calculate, approximately 11% of what the equity was actually worth. The family home was addressed in a separate section. Michelle described it as underutilized for a single occupant, and proposed that it be transferred to the family, meaning to herself and Daniel, with a specific recommendation that I consider a senior living community she had already identified, which she described as exceptional and which was located 40 minutes outside of Nashville. She closed her portfolio when she finished. She looked at me with the expression of someone who has just made a very reasonable offer and is confident in the outcome. We want this to be fair, Robert. We want you to be comfortable, but the reality is that the clinics need consistent leadership going forward, and Daniel is the right person to provide that. I think Eleanor would agree, if she were here. There it was again. My dead wife's name, deployed like a prop. I looked at Daniel. He was looking at a spot on the table approximately 8 inches to the left of my hands. He had not spoken a single word since he said hello when he walked in. My son, the man I had coached through his first job interview, taught to drive on an empty parking lot in the rain, sat beside in an emergency room at 2 a.m. when he broke his arm in a fall. The man I had, for 43 years, believed without question was my son in every sense of the word. He was letting his wife auction off my life, and he did not have the decency to look me in the eye while she did it. I took a long, slow breath. I reached down beside my chair for the single manila folder I had brought with me. That was a thorough presentation, I said. I appreciate the effort. Michelle nodded, already beginning to look satisfied. But before we discuss any terms, there are a few documents I think we need to review first. The door at the far end of the conference room opened at that precise moment. Frank Morrison walked in. He was dressed in a charcoal suit, unhurried, carrying his briefcase. And the particular quality of his presence in a room, the quiet weight of it, changed the atmosphere immediately. Michelle's head turned toward him, and I watched the confidence rearrange itself into something more complicated on her face. She knew who Frank was. She had dealt with him in the weeks prior, but she had expected him to be sitting beside me when she arrived, not walking in mid-sentence from a separate entrance. Frank nodded to me, set his briefcase on the table, and took the chair to my right. He did not acknowledge Michelle's portfolio, or the printed succession framework still sitting open in front of her. He opened his briefcase and removed a folder of his own, considerably thinner than hers. Mrs. Hargrove, he said Michelle's last name, used with a precise, deliberate formality that made it clear this was a professional encounter, not a family one. I've had the opportunity to review your succession proposal in detail. It's well organized. However, there are some foundational documents governing the Callaway Medical Group's ownership structure that your proposal doesn't appear to have accounted for. Michelle leaned forward slightly. I had my own counsel review. I'm sure you did, Frank said pleasantly. Your counsel may not have had access to the full corporate charter. He slid a document across the table. A copy of the original articles I had filed nearly 20 years ago, with a paragraph near the bottom highlighted in yellow. Article 9, Section C. This clause governs the conditions under which any transfer of controlling equity in the group can occur. You'll see the language specifies that a transfer of controlling interest can only be executed in favor of a direct lineal descendant of the founding partners. That's not sentimental language. That's a binding legal restriction. I can tell you it was not accidental. It was specifically constructed to prevent exactly the kind of scenario your proposal describes. Michelle stared at the highlighted paragraph. Her attorney had missed it, or hadn't thought it would apply. The certainty on her face was developing small fractures at the edges. Daniel is Robert's son, she said. Her voice still controlled, but no longer quite as smooth. He is a direct, lineal descendant. Frank clasped his hands on the table. That brings me to the second document. He produced the envelope from the laboratory in Atlanta. It was sealed with a certification sticker, and he held it up so they could all see the lab's official stamp before he opened it. The sound of the envelope opening was very small in the quiet room. He removed the single page inside, scanned it briefly, then set it flat on the table where anyone at this end of the room could read it. As executor of the Callaway estate, and in strict compliance with the terms of the corporate charter, I was legally obligated to confirm the qualifying status of any proposed beneficiary before any transfer could proceed. Frank said, "This is a certified genetic comparison analysis conducted by an accredited laboratory with full chain of custody documentation." He paused. He looked at Daniel, not at Michelle, when he said the next part. The analysis is conclusive. The probability that Daniel Hargrove is the biological son of Robert Callaway is effectively zero. The room went completely still. Tyler took his remaining earbud out. Michelle was on her feet before the sentence was finished, and when she spoke, her voice had shed every layer of professional polish and was simply loud and raw. She said I had manufactured the results, that it was a desperate attempt by a bitter old man to punish his family, that her attorney would have it challenged in court within the week. She said Eleanor would be ashamed of me. She gripped the edge of the table and leaned across it and told me I would regret this. I did not respond to any of it. I watched Daniel. He had not moved. He had not stood up, had not shouted, had not joined his wife's escalating fury. He was sitting in his chair in the same position he had been in since he sat down, and he was staring at the laboratory document on the table in front of him with an expression I will not easily forget. It was not anger. It was not accusation. It was the look of a man who has just learned that a significant portion of his own story belongs to someone else, that the chapter he thought was about identity was actually about mystery, and that he is only now, at 43 years old, finding out that the mystery exists. He looked up from the document and found my eyes, and for the first time since he had walked into the room, he held my gaze. We looked at each other across that table, my wife's table, the one she had refinished herself on 3 separate weekends, and something passed between us that was complicated and real, and entirely separate from what Michelle was still saying behind him. Frank spoke over her calmly. He addressed her directly, without raising his voice, which had the effect of making her volume seem disproportionate. The terms of the corporate charter were not circumventable by an external succession proposal, he told her. The family trust, which governed the property, including the residence, specified similarly explicit language about lineal descent. Both documents predated this conversation by many years. Neither could be challenged on the basis that the challenger was disappointed by them. Her proposal, as presented, had no legal foundation on which to proceed. She and Daniel were welcome to consult any other attorney they wished. Frank would be happy to share the relevant documentation with that attorney directly. Michelle gathered her portfolio. Her hands were not quite steady. She looked at me with something that had moved past fury into something more hollow, the expression of someone who bet heavily on a card they were certain about and watched it fail. She had come into this room this morning as a person who believed she was going to walk out with a medical group and a house in East Nashville. She was leaving with neither. And the knowledge of it was etched into every line of her face. She said my name once more. At the door. Sharply and without anything attached to it. Then she walked out. Daniel stood slowly. He picked up his copy of the laboratory report from the table. He folded it once and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He looked at Frank and thanked him, which I thought was a remarkable thing to do under the circumstances, and which told me something important about my son that I had perhaps never fully appreciated. Then he looked at me. "Dad," he said. Just that. He had never in his life called me anything other than Dad, and he used the word now not as an accusation or a question, but as a statement of fact, stubborn and simple, as though he were planting a flag in uncertain terrain. I told him we should talk. Not today, but soon. He nodded. He put his hand briefly on my shoulder as he passed my chair, the same way I used to put my hand on his shoulder when he was a boy, and something had gone wrong that neither of us quite knew how to fix. And then he walked out after his wife, and the door swung shut behind him. Tyler was still in his chair. He had been so still for so long that Michelle had apparently forgotten to collect him on her way out. He was looking at the closed door, and then he looked at me. And the elaborate performance of teenage indifference was entirely gone. He looked young. He looked like a boy who had just heard something that would take a long time to understand. I asked him if he wanted to wait while I called his mother to come back. He said no. That was okay. That he could walk to the coffee shop on the corner. He started for the door, then stopped. He turned back. "Grandpa," he said, "did you know? Before today, did you know?" I told him I had only recently found out. He thought about that for a moment. "Does it change things?" he asked. "Like, does it change how you feel?" I thought about Eleanor refinishing that table. 3 weekends. Stripping and sanding and sealing. The result was something genuinely beautiful. The wood was still the same wood, regardless of who had found it. Regardless of what it had been before she got her hands on it. The work she had put into it made it what it was. The work was real. That part did not change. I told Tyler it changed some things and not others, and that figuring out which was going to take some time, and that was all right. He seemed to accept that. He put his earbuds back in and pulled the door open and left. And I could see through the tall windows as he appeared on the sidewalk below and turned toward the corner, his hands in his pockets, his pace unhurried, thinking whatever a 17-year-old boy thinks when the ground has shifted. Frank and I sat in the conference room for a while after. He poured us both water from the pitcher on the sideboard. Neither of us said anything for several minutes. Outside the windows, the city went about its business in the clear November light, indifferent to the private earthquakes that occur constantly inside rooms like this one. Frank told me, eventually, that there were some decisions to make in the coming weeks about the estate structure, about the clinics, about what I wanted the next chapter to look like. He told me there was no rush, that everything was stable legally, and that I should take whatever time I needed. I told him I understood. I told him I had one request to start with. I had already done some searching. I had found a professor of literature at Vanderbilt named Gerald Ashworth, retired now, living in a small house in Murfreesboro. I didn't know what I intended to say to him. I didn't know if the conversation would be the kind that brought clarity or the kind that simply added more to carry. But Daniel was going to have questions I couldn't answer. Questions that belonged to a chapter of this story I had not been present for. And Gerald Ashworth was the only living person who had been. Someone ought to know where to find him, if Daniel ever decided he wanted to ask. Frank wrote the name down without comment. I stayed in the conference room after he left. I looked at Eleanor's table, the long walnut surface with its deep, careful finish, And I thought about what I had told Tyler. Some things change, not others. The work was real. The years were real. The hand on the shoulder was real. The fishing trips and the driving lessons and the emergency room at 2 in the morning were real. Whatever else was true, those things remained true. And I was old enough to understand that truth doesn't require perfect origins to be genuine. I had built my life on harder ground than I knew. I would build what came next on ground I could see clearly. That was enough to begin with.